Hello, everybody. It is Saturday night at 10 o'clock Eastern, 9 o'clock Central, where I am. And this is Starfleet Tactical. I am Chris Weuve, who is, as usual, really, I've got a packed schedule each day. I spend all day, every day, not speaking for my employer. And I have with me a couple of guests this evening. Chris Carlson, who you all know because you've seen him previously on the show, and his longtime friend and writing partner and fellow game design partner and New York Times bestselling author and all sorts of other things, Larry Bond, who I've certainly talked about on the show. Chris and I have both talked about on the show, and we always threatened to have Larry on, and we finally made that happen. So Larry is going to be on the show tonight, and we're going to talk about torpedo boat carriers, the second half of that torpedo boat carrier stuff, but we're also going to talk about some of Larry's stuff. So despite the fact it does not appear to be the case, Chris and Larry are actually in the same location. And by that, I mean the same building. So how are you guys doing in Virginia?
I don't know how to answer that question. Chris, is the pollen bothering you?
It was rather noticeable this morning.
Yeah. Chris has only been in Virginia for a few hours today, so you know, he sampled a lot of the weather and the pollen along the East Coast there between here and Richmond.
Yeah, and for those who haven't done Virginia in the summertime, the Virginia has the worst allergies in the United States, and the number of times when the weather guy would say, "All that stuff you see on the radar, ignore it. It's not really weather; it's pollen." Yeah, so
Yes.
there's a lot
I can't confirm for Georgia's.
Yeah, Georgia can be bad too. There are many things I miss about Virginia, but the pollen is not one of them.
It'll be over soon. The trees are leafing out. I mean, we came out the other day, and all of a sudden, the branches behind the house were all covered with green. And it's like this green wall appears out of nowhere.
Yes,
and we're glad when it finishes because then the pollen goes away and we can step outside again.
Yeah, that's good. What? So, Chris, you've been traveling, obviously,
Yes.
since you're not home. How have your travels gone?
It's one of those cases of it's a good trip, but the reason for the trip is not so good. I have two friends that are in the hospital. One is recovering slowly, and another I do not think will make it.
I am very sorry to hear that. Well, I'm glad that one is recovering. I'm sorry to hear about the other one.
And I got a chance to go and see both of them. So
okay,
that's a plus.
Yeah. So one of them has been I spent the last week doing the Connections Online Professional Wargaming Conference, which last year, one of the people that Chris was talking about was actually one of my presenters. He's somebody that I know too. Chris introduced me to him. So I haven't told the story in a while, but Chris actually hired me to be his replacement because Chris was going to take early retirement, and he didn't want to leave the organization high and dry. So he called me up one day and said, "If I created a job for you, would you take it?" And it involved he had to change a uniformed billet to a civilian billet, and it was going to be hard to do and stuff like that. And it's all bureaucratic, and Chris doesn't like the bureaucratic stuff. But I said, yeah, I'd apply for that. And he goes, okay, I'm motivated to do that. And that conversation was what, February? Something like that?
Mm-hmm. Something like that, yeah.
So the day before the Friday before Labor Day, Chris calls me up and says, okay, the job posts on Monday. And I said, that's great, Chris. What are you talking about? Because it was like literally like six and a half months later. And he reminded me about this conversation we had back in February. And I've totally gone out of my mind. And I'm really glad that I went ahead and applied for it because it turned out to be one of the two best jobs I've ever had. Easily. It was a fantastic job. I miss it every day. I left for reasons that had to do with lifestyle changes and family and stuff like that. I did not leave because I did not like that job. So it was a fantastic job. So it involved me being a naval analyst, which is, one of the things that this show is about. This show is about history and science fiction and the intersection between the two, and we're going to continue that theme tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up the slides that I put together. So I'm also just constantly amazed. It doesn't say it on here, but this is episode 137. So we haven't done it every week. There have been a couple of periods where we haven't done it. Individual weeks missed here and there, and then I think I missed 6 weeks at one point after I had my little visit in the ICU. And as we can see from the next slide, there's going to be an entire month where we're not going to have the show because I'm going to DC for business stuff. Next Saturday night, I'm actually it's on this TDY trip, but I'm actually going to be playing a game of Ogre about the time this rolls around, or I will have just finished it. And then the following 2 weekends, I will be totally and completely, one of those, I think 11 May will be the day I drive back to Dayton. But 4 May, I will be up to my eyeballs in the work project. And it's one of those projects where they specifically told us that the building closes at midnight, so we have to be out by 11 p.m. It's one of those kind of deals. And then the weekend after I get back, I'm going to go to a science fiction convention, so I won't be able to do the show then. But after that, I think it's smooth sailing for 5 weeks in a row. And then once we get to the end of June, it's a maybe. Some of that may change. Chris heard me say this last week. Larry can hear me say it now. I originally said I'm going to do the Exordium second edition read along soon, where I'm planning to do at least 6 episodes on the Exordium series. It's my all-time favorite series. It's got a lot of really interesting combat. They've got a tactically useful FTL drive, but all the sensors are speed of light. So there's this interesting gun kata in space. If you don't know what I mean by gun kata, go watch Equilibrium starring Christian Bale, and it'll teach you all about gun kata, except they do gun kata with spaceships. It's a fascinating book. The entire series reminds me of the best parts of Traveler, and I really want to do it. And I failed my morale roll because I realized that if I pick up Exordium and start going through it again, I will become totally and completely obsessively focused on it for at least 3 months. I owe Chris and Larry a game. And so I decided that it would be bad for me to put myself in the way of temptation by giving me something else to obsess on. So once I get the game into Chris and Larry, I'll be able to focus on Exordium. So core caveats, as always, my opinion's not my employer's, and all images, etc., are the property of their originators. We're going to add some commentary. We're going to talk about, we'll critique the images as they come up, and we'll add some educational value to it. But I'm not making a copyright claim on any of this stuff. This is all stuff I pulled off the net. So please don't sue us. And if you're going to sue anybody, sue me. Because I'm the guy who put together the slides, but don't sue me. Okay, so here's what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk about some of Larry's works. I'm basically going to talk about some stuff I've talked about in the past, but now I've got both Larry and Chris here so that they can add commentary, etc. on it. I'm going to go through some of the slides we did last week, much quicker than we did then. Chris and Larry, interrupt me if you got something to throw in, but I want to just basically do that as the contextualization about torpedo boats and torpedo boat carriers. And then I'm going to go into some stuff on the science fiction side, and I expect that, I expect us to be all over the place with that. And I by no means think that this is the be all and end all on this topic, because I've only included a handful of things. In fact, I just realized that I added something that I never actually put the slides in for. So if nothing else, we'll have to come back and do that in the future. But let's go ahead and start off by looking at some of the stuff that Larry's done, some of which he's done with Chris. So I just pulled this off of Wikipedia, and I know it's incomplete because, for instance, it says with Jim DeFelice, and it didn't list anything there. But I know you've done stuff with Jim, right?
Yeah. Basically the first 2 things, the first team series and the Red Dragons Rising series were the series I did with Jim DeFelice. And,
okay. So
and
when I read,
he's a hell of a writer,
Mhm.
and you should pick up his biography of Omar Bradley if you haven't.
Yeah, that's stellar.
Okay.
Not to mention, it's just about the only biography of Omar Bradley you can find. It's a good biography. It starts out by saying he does not look like Carl Malden, and
True. It's true. He looks worse.
It really talks about his personality in a great way. He also wrote American Sniper, which you may have heard of. So he's a great guy.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, isn't it Omar Bradley who had the great quote about Teddy Roosevelt Jr.? Do you remember
a long time ago?
Yeah, so Teddy Roosevelt Jr. I'm almost positive it's Omar Bradley. I could be wrong. So I'm going to tell the Teddy Roosevelt Jr. story anyway. So Teddy Roosevelt Jr., who actually was Teddy Roosevelt III, but okay, the Roosevelt family, apparently that branch of the Roosevelt family didn't understand how Jr. worked. They called him Teddy Roosevelt Jr. He was a general. He was the oldest guy to assault the beach on Omaha Beach, the oldest guy to go ashore on D-Day in the first wave. And he managed to convince his boss that there needed to be a general officer on the beach to direct stuff and to sort of make things happen on the beach. And his boss, I think was a corps commander, maybe a division commander. In any event, his boss sort of said, "Okay, I can't argue with your assessment." And he said yes, but he came away thinking that he had just, basically that Teddy Roosevelt Jr. was going to die on the beach. And so they got blown off course. They end up landing a mile away. And so the question is, do they assault where they're at, or do they go across move to where they were supposed to go? And he just sort of looked around and said, "We're going to start the war right here." And they assaulted at that point. And he was standing on the beach giving directions to people. And there's like bullets all around him. And he's got a cane because he doesn't walk very well. He had an injury of some sort. And so there's bullets flying all around him. And he's just walking up and down the beach. And he did that for hours and nobody got him. I'm almost positive that it's Omar Bradley that when they asked him, "What's the bravest thing you ever saw in combat?" Like without hesitation, he said, "Teddy Roosevelt on Omaha Beach." So Roosevelt is one of my two favorite general officer, flag officers from World War II. The other one is Willis Lee. Mm-hmm. They're my two favorites. So the things that are in red because I've talked about them before. Larry, when did the first edition of Harpoon come out?
April of 1980.
Okay, so this game has been
Center for Naval Analyses as a JG. I hadn't even been made lieutenant yet, and I got a copy of it from Adventure Games in the mail.
That's and somewhere I have a copy of that.
Well, hang
on. It's in the 149 boxes of books in the storage unit. So there's been lots of editions of Harpoon. You're currently on the 5th edition, if I remember correctly. If you have any interest in modern combat, even if you're not a gamer and don't want to play the game, you should still pick up Harpoon and read the ancillary materials that go with it, because it does it's a fantastic reference work. I used to keep it on my bookshelf in various places I've worked, just because it's a fantastic unclassified reference. And so I could pull stuff out and look at the generation of stuff and, make arguments about stuff. And I could have that entire conversation at the unclassified level. It was fantastic. The Jerry Mitchell series, I talked about that, and I'm going to have a slide on that. We'll talk about that in a second. And then the last one is Lash Up, which, if I remember correctly, started off as a novella that Larry wrote, and then Chris expanded it into a novel.
We both expanded it.
We worked together on the expansion. Yeah, it was originally appeared in a Techno-thriller anthology that Steve Kuntz put together, which was a great idea, and there's a lot of good stuff in there. It goes Combat, just very simple title. I think it ended up being 2 volumes.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think I have that. But here's what the cover of the paperback looks like. I found out about this because one of my colleagues at my last job had it sitting on his table in his cubicle. And I walked in and said, I've never heard of this novel. What's this about? And so I got a chance to look at it, and I went home and called Chris and said, what's going on with this? And it turns out Chris is the co-author, but there was a time period in Chris's career where he was not allowed to put his name on the front cover of books like this. And so Larry and Chris wrote a lot of stuff that just says Larry on the front cover, but in the acknowledgments it says Chris is really the co-author, but his name's not on the front cover. And there's a little summary of what it's about. It's basically somebody at SPA figures out why the GPS satellites are going dark and comes up with a plan to intercept the Chinese weapons that are shooting at the GPS satellites by taking two old canceled programs, marrying them together, and launching something into space with 4 months warning? 3 months?
I think we give them 70 days, and then we buy them an additional week with at the cost of another GPS satellite. And
yeah, it's pretty impressive.
It's not realistic, but it's not supposed to be a message, but there is a message there that about listening to people with good ideas, even if they aren't in your particular stovepipe.
So things I like about it: it's one of 2 novels I know of where the United States secretly creates a space force and doesn't tell anybody about it because they're trying to solve.
They do at the end.
They do at the end, and they do in Tom May's Sword into Darkness. They do at the end too. But in both of those cases, I love both those novels, and I usually read them back to back just because I like that synergy effect of that. I also like it, and I could see Chris's hands all over this because, like, at one point there's this great discussion that takes place in the tank in the Pentagon, which is the one conference room there, the high-level conference room, where an Air Force general is, you can't do this, it violates the JSIDS process. In the JSIDS process, for those of you who are not acquisition and requirements geeks, is the Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System. Nobody calls it that. Everybody calls it JSIDS. And it's the process whereby DoD figures out what the requirement is, and then specifies that requirement so they can hand it off to the acquisition system to, I don't just need any rock. I need this particular rock. I need a rock that looks like this, and it's this weight, and it has these other characteristics, et cetera, and it's to guarantee that you get the right kind of rock. And the job that Chris used to do, that I then did afterwards, part of our job was to go through and oversee a tiny little bit of that process, the stuff that intersected with the intelligence community, to make sure they got the threat part right, so that when acquisition programs, when the requirements are being written, and when the acquisition program is trying to buy something, they understand what the threat is. I always summarize this as, you don't want to build a ship capable of dealing with subsonic anti-ship cruise missiles and then discover the entire world has supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles, right? So it's about making sure that everybody is making that stuff work. The same colleague whose desk had it on, and who's responsible for me knowing about this book, made the observation that the only part that he found totally unrealistic in the entire novel was the idea that somebody at SPA War could be a hero.
Harsh.
Yeah, he was a common signals guy. So he spoke from experience. So I absolutely love this book. I recommend it without reservations. And it actually, one of the things I really like about it is it sort of showed some of the real world problems that you would have in trying to do any sort of program. And the sort of stuff that like in science fiction, like in Star Trek, they never have this problem. They're trying to stand up a program and get stuff taken care of right away. And like they're having problems like, where do you put all the workers? And how do you give them classified network access? You got to get the equipment, just physically installing the computers and installing all the routers and getting them all hooked up and all that other stuff that you have to do. I mean, it's all physical stuff. Even if you've made an administrative decision to make it happen tomorrow, it's not like there's this big warehouse full of gear. You still have to procure the gear and get it in place. And so they've got people that are sleeping at the office. And I love the part where they hire somebody who used to run events at a hotel just to make sure that everybody gets fed.
Jeffrey was a late addition, but he just fit.
Yeah, he did. It was just.
I mean, we actually wanted to give him a bigger role, but we didn't need him in the end to do all that good stuff. But you can imagine this guy coming in from the outside, and his job is to take care of the people. He's probably setting up something so that there's a dry cleaner available, or people there's a pharmacy, there's health and welfare kind of stuff.
It reminded me one time Steve Jobs said, "Why do people go home? People sleep in their office all the time. Why do they eventually go home?" And I used to work in the tech business in the 1990s when I was a refugee from DOD. I worked for an internet startup. And there were people that, all the developers had couches in their office so they could spend the night at the office. And all the quality assurance people did. And we had one in tech support that frequently got slept on too, because that's just sort of the environment it was. And so Steve Jobs asked the question, why do they go home? And so the answer was, eventually people run out of clean clothes. So he put in a laundromat at corporate headquarters so they could do laundry at work. So, all right, so let's go talk about Jerry Mitchell for a little bit. This is a fantastic series. As I always describe it, Jerry Mitchell is a fighter pilot, a newly minted F-18 pilot, getting ready to do his first deployment, has an accident on rollout. The ejection was successful in that he didn't die. The ejection was unsuccessful in that he seriously jacked up one of his wrists. And they said, okay, you can't be a fighter pilot anymore. You don't meet the physical for the fighter pilot. So you can either take a medical, you can transfer to something like Intel, or you can be a surface warfare officer. And he said, I want to be a submariner. And they said, no. The Navy's willing to spend $1 million to train you, but we're only willing to spend it once, and we've already spent it. And so those are your options. And what the admiral did not realize is that Jerry's uncle was a senator. And so after a quick call to the senator, Jerry finds himself in a room with a really seriously ticked off flag officer who said, okay, you're going to get your chance to be a submariner, but if you're not perfect, you will pay. And so he decides he's going to be perfect. And that's, everything I told you is basically the first half of chapter 1. So I didn't really give anything away. And there's, 6 books in the series. I'd love to see a sequel. I'd love to see another book in the series. I'm not sure how you'd fit it in, given where he is at the end of the last book. Yes. He's fairly senior.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's hard to have Action Man when he's a. Well, I won't say it's impossible. One of the best action. I read a Steve Kuntz book, the one with Jake Grafton, after he's had his accident, and he's working at the Pentagon. And you don't think of a job at the Pentagon as being terribly exciting or noteworthy. And Steve wrote just a crackerjack story there. So yeah, theoretically, we could, Jerry's gets his, he finishes his squadron tour. He goes to the Pentagon. What's a good step up at the Pentagon from squadron, Chris? Sub, brother.
Well, you could be the CNO's chief of staff, I guess.
CNO chief of staff. Now there's this guy with some horsepower. Is he an action man? That's the question. Can we come up with a good story for the CNO chief of staff that doesn't involve having to figure out how many seatings he needs for the for the next soiree. Yeah.
Well, or you could do something that's close enough on the heels of the last one that he actually hasn't rotated into a new job.
Yeah. Well, that would be the thing.
In theory, you've got some space in between some of those other novels. You could fit something in, but then the question is, why aren't there any references to it, right? So there's always a problem with going back.
Yeah, that can be tricky.
So, but all I can tell you is you'll sell at least one. And if you ever do a sequel to Lash Up, you'd sell one to me too. So
the only thing, the one we really worry about is, I think it was after Shattered Trident came out. And was that the one that you came out for, Chris, and we did the signing together? It was one of them we did the signing together for. And I kid you not, we did the signing. The next day, I'm sitting down at the email in the morning, and somebody sends this great fan mail about how much they love Shattered Trident. When will the next one be out? You're killing me here, How fast do they think we can type? I mean, Shattered Trident was really supposed to be the end of it. Fatal Thunder and Arctic Gambit were just, I think you came up with the idea for both of those, didn't you, Chris?
I had the initial thought for both of them, and then we refined it together.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things I really liked about Arctic Gambit, and one of the things I love about this entire series is that, it's easy enough to say Jack Ryan's going to run off and do something, right? But if you get to a point where Jack Ryan has no business running off and doing stuff, right? And so, by the time that Jerry is a squadron commander, he's got no business being on the mission he goes on in Arctic Thunder. He really doesn't. And you guys know that, and so you didn't just ignore it, and you grab that bull by the horns. And I love that conversation where he's talking to the skipper of the submarine, who's not happy that somebody else is the senior officer on his submarine for his mission, running his mission, right? He's in the same situation that Stephen Collins' character's in Star Trek The Motion Picture, where Admiral Kirk is on board and has taken command of his ship, and what the hell is going on? That's not how this is supposed to work. Yeah. And in this particular case, in the case of Kirk talking about it, he gave, he gave sort of a somewhat self-serving answer, if I remember correctly. In this particular case, I love how Jerry just sort of says, look, I'm not any happier about this than you are, because this should be your mission. I trust you to run this mission, but it wasn't my decision. It was the president's decision, and we both got to live with it. And that's the way that would work. The president gets to make decisions like that, and he tells them, this is the way it's going to be, and I don't care that neither one of you like it. And the president, in this case, as a former submariner, they can't even say, you don't understand the implications of this, sir, because he does understand the implications of it.
I forget whether it was Chris' ideas or mine to put Jerry on board the boat, although obviously he had to be on the boat. But the circumstances simply aligned that there was a very good rationale for putting him there. And I think both Chris and I are very workmanlike in showing enough of the process so that, and not glossing over the difficulties, so that when something like that comes up, you can either write around a plot problem, or you can just write the plot problem into the story.
And the other nice little thing that warped out of that is that in doing so, Larry and I hearkened back to the first book.
Yes, very much so, because that's the thing. It's a very interesting progression. All the characters are constantly evolving in their roles, but there's a reason why they're still in fairly close proximity to each other. and you see a lot of, you know, let's just say that in the first book, the guy who ends up being the president, in the first book, Jerry Mitchell wouldn't have been his first choice to go on a mission. You really wouldn't have been. So Chris and Larry were both serving naval officers, and they understand how this bureaucratic stuff works. And I don't mean bureaucratic is not intended as a pejorative in this case. It's just like it's a hierarchical organization, and it's got people at various levels, and people are people, and they have to work together, but they work together within this particular structure. And Chris and Larry understand how this structure works, etc. And so it's a really good model. These books are all on my science fiction recommended reading list, despite the fact that some of the stuff in the Jerry Mitchell series might have almost been science fiction when it was originally written, but none of it's science fiction now. There's some stuff with drones and things like that. And so, but it's on my reading list because I think they do just a bang up job of sort of explaining how an organization like that would work. Right? How the organizations work. And I love the fact that characters who couldn't stand each other early on and sort of viewed each other as problems to be solved get to the point where they have total and complete trust in each other. And that happens along a couple of different lines in this. So they're fantastic books. You should run out and buy all of them in every format they're available.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
So I actually pretty much do have them in every format they're available. Okay, so now go through some of the slides I did last week that Chris and I talked about last week, but I'm only going to sort of do the high level over bit of this. And so the first one, I talked about Corbett and the flotilla. Corbett sort of splits it up into the battle fleet, which is about fighting for sea control, cruisers, which are about commiserating and protection of the sea lines of communications, and the flotilla, which is small, specialized craft, mostly littorals. But this is all written in like the 1920 timeframe, 1910 timeframe. And so the world has changed a lot since then, and a lot of this stuff is not applicable. And that's sort of a common theme when you talk about torpedo boats. Torpedo boats were originally part of this flotilla idea. And nowadays, most of that stuff is done by aircraft. Not all of it, but a lot of times it's done by aircraft. But if we take this out into space, right, in a science fiction setting, there is no aircraft equivalent in outer space. There isn't something that uses a totally different media to have a dramatic increase in performance in the same way that you get on the surface. So I don't have to squint very hard to say that Star Trek should look more like 1910, 1920 than it should look like 2020, right? I think it's a better model of going back to 100 years ago in terms of what, I don't mean file off the serial numbers and run it through the science fiction converter. What I mean is just in terms of the kind of problems they have to solve and how you think about the capabilities of different craft to solve that problem. It's all dependent upon assumptions. Act accordingly if you're writing something yourself. But I don't have to squint that hard to see why Corbett would be relevant in the future, in a science fiction future. Okay, torpedoes are important, but they weren't important early on. Everybody thought they were going to be important early on, but they had serious performance issues. There was performance issues in the firing platforms. They did become important, but not as I can use a small ship to go and kill a capital ship way. They became integrated into the capital battle fleet, right? So they were part of capital ship offense and defense, and they also were used on submarines and then later on aircraft. But it took a while for the torpedo to even come close to realizing its potential, arguably not until World War II. The British built some ships that were designed to carry torpedo boats, but they really sort of viewed them as mobile torpedo bases. They weren't thinking about, participating in a fleet action by dumping torpedo boats out. FOUDRE, Lightning was commissioned by the French in the late 1890s, and she ended up being a totally and completely experimental platform. She got reconfigured a bunch of different times, but she started off as a torpedo boat cruiser that could do that torpedo boat tender function of going and setting up, being a mobile torpedo boat base. But they actually tried to deploy these things and sort of practice with them in something that looked like maybe using them in a fleet action. So like doing this at the high seas, not just at some sheltered bay someplace. And so that's a picture of FOUDRE. And so why do we care about FOUDRE? We care about FOUDRE for two reasons. First of all, there were a bunch of French postcards that had all sorts of pictures of FOUDRE on. And so we've got a lot of good quality pictures of FOUDRE that sort of survived over the years. And this photo in particular, variations of this photo, if you do a search for FOUDRE, this is the photo that comes out that shows this really nifty mechanism they had to put these torpedo steam launches into the water. Note how small this thing is, and that sloping thing up front is its one and only torpedo tube. That's going to be important. And the reason why that's important, well, I'll get to in a second. This is sort of her general layout. She could carry 12 of these things, which was way more than any of those British efforts. The orange ones are just auxiliary boats. The red circles there, and there should be another set of red circles up front. I just didn't bother to put them in. I should probably change that and put them in because she carried basically two bays with 6 each. So the torpedo boats were bad. They were bad. They were small, which meant poor seakeeping. They were steam. Steam is cranky, can be cranky. Steam gives you a lot of capabilities, but it can be cranky. They were very poorly armed with a slow torpedo that had basically no guidance system whatsoever. And by no guidance system, I mean nothing that would keep it running straight even, let alone actually homing. And they were slow. They were slower than the FOUDRE herself. So this is just not a recipe for success. And so even if the idea had panned out, and you can maybe make the argument that it could have if airplanes had not come along, even if the idea pans out, this is problematic. Now, because the technology just wasn't up to it. Now, the idea itself is kind of problematic because of issues with torpedo boats are designed for performance in such a way that it makes them difficult to perform in heavy weather, right? They're very susceptible to wave action. They're very susceptible to wind. They're just problematic. And they kind of have to be that way for this kind of mission because you want them small, you want them difficult targets, and everything that makes them a difficult target also means they don't have very good seakeeping characteristics. And so you're sort of kind of stuck, you're stuck with one set of problems. Ironically, the best torpedo boat out there was the torpedo boat destroyer. That's one of the great ironies of history, is that the destroyer, originally created to deal with these things, turned out to be a better torpedo boat platform than torpedo boats were. So you can make the argument that FOUDRE was a failure, hard to launch and recover them, poor seakeeping, the torpedo boat wasn't very good, and generally torpedo boats not useful in fleet battles. But on the other hand, it was an experiment. It was a successful way to, it was a successful test of the concepts with the technology they had at the time. And so it gave them the answers they were looking for. It was arguably a success as a way to set up a base. And so like, okay, if it's useful to set up, if torpedo boats are useful and they can be under some circumstances, it's a useful way to move torpedo boats around. And I would argue that sort of philosophically, aircraft carriers are really kind of the same idea. It's a small, high-performance platform carried by a larger platform to give it endurance and to give it range and to give it rearming capability and to carry all the things that you can't put on the torpedo boat, like a place to sleep and a bunch of food, right? All endurance sorts of things. And it's also a garage to fix them. You can make the argument that an aircraft carrier and a torpedo boat carrier are really kind of the same idea. You just have to sort of tweak one of the nouns. Okay, so let's talk about the science fiction equivalents. The one that I was going to add, and I totally forgot because I got distracted. I went out to dinner with some friends who are moving out of the area, and I totally forgot that I had to include The Expanse when I came back. So I'm not going to talk about The Expanse, or at least I don't have any slides. I can talk about them at the end. First of all, I should stop and say, Chris, Larry, Chris, you commented on all that stuff last week when I ran through it. In fact, there's a bunch of slides that Chris provided me that I largely didn't include because they were nitty-gritty details on the torpedoes and stuff like that, which were fantastic slides, but I didn't want to do them in the overview. Do either of you have any comments on what I just said?
No, overall, I think you got it. You got it on target, and I don't disagree with you that aircraft carriers with torpedo bombers look, act, and smell a lot like a torpedo boat carrier with a bunch of small torpedo boats. You know, when you look at a ship function, if you will, they are parallel.
Yeah, they really kind of are, I think, and that's important for a couple of reasons. Not the least of which is it's when you're thinking about extrapolating things to a science fiction universe, it's always useful to be able to sort of say, okay, you know, we don't have you know, science fiction dreadnoughts in the current universe, but what do we have that's kind of close that maybe I can learn something from, right? I don't like the idea of just taking a World War II fleet and filing off the serial numbers for a whole bunch of different reasons, some of which I'm going to get into when I do the naval treaties talk. But you know, that doesn't mean that there isn't something to be learned there. So, Larry, do you have any thoughts on this? You're seeing this all very rapid fire for the first time, but you're an experienced naval officer and a historian yourself. So,
well, I watched the first show and saw Chris's presentation and everything. So I know sort of what you're talking about. And yeah, the basic theme is big guy can carry a bunch of little guys, and presumably the little guys can do something that the big guy can't. He launch torpedoes, fly. What always amazed me about the whole steam launched torpedo boat problem is that while the tech was very new and they were experimenting with different things, they had to understand the behavior of small boats in heavy seas.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to look at the developmental process of FOUDRE or one of the other vessels and see if anybody said, by the way, does anybody know how we're going to launch these boats once we get up to past Sea State 2? And how that got missed. But as we both all know, there were other major mistakes made with ship designs in this period that did not have to do with dropping a decimal point. Okay, there were some serious judgmental errors made. And as you pointed out, Chris Weuve, this was an experiment, and it was a successful experiment. It showed them, taught them a lot.
Yeah, starting with this idea. The idea isn't necessarily half-baked, but we don't have the right ingredients yet.
If you imagine a bunch of speedy little crafts zooming off, but 60 knots doesn't cut it.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, in the real world, there's a whole bunch of interesting functions that sort of went by the wayside because of airplanes, right? You know, this idea of cruisers as the eyes of the fleet. Does anybody talk about cruisers as the eyes of the fleet anymore? No, airplanes are the eyes of the fleet. Satellites are the eyes of the fleet. Over-the-horizon radars are the eyes of the fleet, right? Electronic support measures, you know, radio direction finding, all that stuff's the eyes of the fleet. Nobody talks about cruisers as the eyes of the fleet anymore. And so it's I think there's a lot of those documents that when you read them, like when you read Corbett, you have to put a lot of the stuff in quotes and to emphasize, you know, the thing that does the cruiser function is a better way to phrase it. Cruisers is shorthand for the thing that does the cruiser function. And so he's really identifying cruisers. And in those days, it was associated with individual ship types in a way that the nouns have changed, but the verbs haven't. So, but in any event, here's the science fiction equivalence I'm going to look at. And I will admit, I'm not really going to look at Star Trek. I put it on the list because I'm on a show called Starfleet Tactical, but everybody knows that frequently don't talk about Star Trek on this show. Starfleet Tactical just sort of came out of the fact that Alec Peters picked the name of the show, and we still call it that. But these all there's all fundamental differences between all these examples. I'm using these as different examples of a torpedo boat-like function that's being carried by something that's larger, but they're all very different. They all have FTL drives associated with the larger carrier, with the exception of the Expanse. There's little or no tactical FTL. That's the thing that's mostly the same about them. And some of them also have like a performance penalty for the larger ships, but not all of them have that. But they fundamentally do different things in combat. And I find that very interesting, because you can look at them and go, they're all kind of the same thing, aren't they? And it's like, no, they have different missions. And so let's talk about some of that real quick. So have you guys read Down Below Station by chance, or anything else in the Alliance Union universe?
I have not.
Okay, so there's 2 books that I fundamentally recommend in this universe. Down Below Station, of which you're looking at the cover of the DAW paperback edition of that book. And the other one is Hellburner. So in this universe, what those big ships you're looking at are called carriers. Her stuff is pretty sui generis, though. So she uses a name that sounds familiar, and she has naval ranks, but they really don't translate into traditional naval terms, other than some words in common. A carrier there is both a carrier of rider ships, which are the things I have circled there. They're small vessels. They have a crew of like 10 or 12. They have a lot of missile armament, and they can seriously screw up your ship. Very high sublight speed, a huge amount of acceleration. But carriers also have a huge amount of acceleration. They're actually faster. They carry 4 of these riders, and they also carry about 1,000 troops. And they've got a shit ton of weapons. But these small vessels are useful to sort of spread out the offense and defense. The thing about that really sort of defines combat in her universe is what she refers to as long scan. These ships are moving at high sublight velocities, which means, but all your sensors are speed of light sensors. So you're dealing with a situation where all of your information is always time late or close to time late, and you're seeing parts of the problem, and you have to predict where things actually are. And so long scan is radar. It's like weather radar, in that, you watch a weather radar and it will show you everything up to where you are, and then it will predict where things go after that, so you can play beyond it. Except the thing with long scan is you're dealing with humans that are making decisions. And so it's not like just predicting which direction the wind is going to blow the storm. It's what is the human decision making going to be? So you got lots of things where you've got color-coded cones of probability, and people are trying to fight a battle with color-coded cones of probability. And these small rider ships are capable of screwing up a carrier bad enough that it might damage its ability to escape, or leave it as easy meat for another ship. If nothing else, though, they complicate that prediction problem, right? It's hard to put ordnance on a target when you don't know where the target is. But they're utterly fantastic. I would argue that riders act more like escorts, like a destroyer, than they do like the flotilla. They're all about protecting their carrier and sort of defining the battle space in such a way that the carrier and its big guns can take care of it. The book Hellburner, which she wrote significantly after Down Below Station, like 10, 15 years later, is about, it actually takes place much earlier in the timeline, and it's about the development of the Rider program. And it's a fantastic look of how the acquisition process works in her universe. And I know that there's a whole bunch of you that just zoned out when I said that. But it's actually a fascinating book because she gets into all the bureaucratic stuff. There's also a murder involved, and how all that stuff gets set up in it. Like at one point, one of the characters says something to the effect of, the reason why this program is behind is you gave us a shitty old space station to work on, and we're taking all of our research money and using it for operations and maintenance. And so we told you that this was going to be a problem, and you insisted on sticking us here anyway. And so that's part of the reason why we're behind, Senator. But there's lots of other interesting things in there, and it's sort of you see a lot of the background stuff that later comes out explosively in Down Below Station. So here's some more artwork. On the lower right-hand corner, we have the cover for the game, The Company War, which is set in the universe, and you can see the little spots where the writers dock. You can also see that in this other illustration in the upper left-hand corner. The vanes you see in the back are part of the FTL drive system, and then there's a couple of fan interpretations of the writer ships. They're described in Hellburner as being sort of mantle shaped like, and so that's what somebody came up with for them. And that illustration up in the upper right-hand corner came from the original Down Below Station. It's one of two illustrations. It's in Down Below Station. And I think there's a really good chance that C.J. Cherry drew that herself. I think that's where that came from. It does not look like something that a professional artist slaved over. So... next is Honor Harrington, David Weber's Honor Harrington, and the light attack craft. Now they're light in Honor Harrington terms. Each one of these things is about the length of an Arleigh Burke class destroyer, but it's about 3 times the mass, slightly less than 3 times the mass of one. This is a universe with no FTL sensors and a magic tech stealth field that makes surprise possible. And you can see the carrier there. That's a Manticoran carrier, and it's got 50 bays per side, so it can carry 100 of these things. And you can see the relative size. I've got one circled down there. That's the same as the one that you see up in the upper right-hand corner.
I'm gonna argue a little bit there, Chris.
Go for it.
They do have FTL sensors, because you can detect the modulation in the alpha wall, and that's 64 times the speed of light. So that's what makes this more of a submarine approach. You have lots of great passive. Your active sucks.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Fair enough. You can detect something. They have some limited sensors, and they get detection. They don't get targeting from it.
Yep.
So, it's interesting because I have in the past talked about the Frank Chadwick discussion of targeting that was published in the game Star Cruiser, and about how he talks about the sort of the history, the development of warfare, of naval warfare is about solving the warfare in general is about solving the targeting problem. And that's really sort of paralleled in Honor Harrington. There's a lot of discussion over time as the technology changes about how you can solve the targeting problem. And you start off with, it's not useful to throw very many more missiles than you can already throw at the enemy, because you run into interference issues and you can't control them well enough to make it worth your effort. But over time, they're able to do that better and better. Now, it's interesting. You see that LACs evolve over time. They start off as basically flotilla-type weapons that are, it's just, system defense forces, light weapons. They don't really get used for a whole lot. You never see them. You know that they exist. You know that Honor commanded one, but you never really see them until the book where Honor outfits a freighter to carry a bunch of them to go do counter-piracy stuff, which is really kind of a flotilla-type mission. So she takes a flotilla-type craft out to do a flotilla-type mission and discovers along the way that they're useful for things other than flotilla-type missions. And so combining some technology they get from the Graysons to power them, they realize, we could actually use them in a fleet action, and to ambush people. We could use them in a situation where that's sort of beyond what we currently do with them. and sort of redefine their utility and build specialized ones to do this. And the other thing I love about these things in the books is David comes up with a mission for them, that the Manticorans deploy them to basically be ship killers. But over time, that mission becomes obsolete, and they design a new generation of them to do other missions. And there's sort of this steady evolution of what they do and what they can and can't do, and what their preferred mission is. And it reminds me an awful lot about the comment that was made by Wayne Hughes to the effect of, the only vessels in the US Navy in World War II that did the job that they were designed to do as their primary mission, that actually did that job, were like mine layers and minesweepers. Everybody else got called upon to do a job that was different as their primary job, that was different than the primary job they were designed to do. So, love the Lax and Honor Harrington. So I've also talked about Scott Geyer's Ganellan series. You can tell that the books are from the 1990s because you can see this late 80s, early 90s bitmap art. If you sort of zoom in on the wording there, you can see the dot matrix printer at work, and the low resolution of the images. But they're very, very, the series is very interesting. There's no FTL sensors in this, although they do develop one over time. It comes into play in one of the later books, that will at least tell you when people are about to drop out of hyper. The sublight speeds are relatively low. It's not like in the Honorverse where they get up to like 0.85 C if you give them enough time. They're much lower than that. The FTL drive is basically limited to the mothership, and you actually need multiple ships to do it. They do this weird grid link thing where they all jump at once, and I don't pretend to understand exactly what Scott had in mind with this. But he's got really a naval aviation model here, in that the corvettes, the motherships do have guns, and they have some big guns, but the corvettes are the way that you sort of do stuff at a distance, right? You don't really take your mothership any more than you would take an aircraft carrier in close. You try to avoid taking a mothership in close. They do eventually start building battleships, because they decide that they need battleships against the enemy that they're fighting. But they're generally these corvette things that have a crew of about 10-ish, right? Crew of 10 to 12 is sort of a common theme for this. And you see the corvette there, and it carries an endo atmospheric planetary lander, which endo-atmospheric and planetary are kind of redundant, but okay. And so that's basically a delta wing lander that it can't get the entire crew off in one fell swoop, but it can get a big chunk of them off. And so they each have their own landing capability. Here's a couple of other drawings. You see, so those original ones were done by Scott Geyer. These are done by somebody else, and you can sort of see the three-dimensional corvette there. And the purple ship up there is the equivalent of a corvette. It's a Cone interceptor. Cone is Kone, and that's one of the alien races. Those are actually substantially larger than a corvette, but they perform essentially the same function. They're substantially larger than corvettes because cones are substantially larger than humans. They're like basically the size of a small elephant. Okay, so my guess is you guys haven't read Scott Geyer's stuff, have you?
No, I wrote it down, and I'll check it out because I'm all for new stuff.
Yeah, Scott got caught in the Del Rey purge of the mid list, and so he had a 5-book series planned, and they canceled him after book 3. And then book 4 later got published through Third Millennium Publishing, which was Michael McCollum's website. I take some credit for that. I know it would have gotten published eventually, but I had contacted Scott Geyer because I really liked his stuff and asked him about whether he had a publisher or not, and suggested that he go get in contact with Michael McCollum, and I did the introduction between them. So I claim at least a tiny little bit of credit for that fourth book getting published. So, so Traveler is interesting, and I'm going to spend some time doing a deep dive on the Traveler universe at some point. Specifically on the works of Martin Doherty. Martin is a British defense analyst, and he gets it. He is a Corbettian like myself, and he understands that there are parts of Traveler that are really about the flotilla and law enforcement type stuff, right? In the Traveler universe, the flotilla bleeds over into things that we would consider to be a Coast Guard missions like customs. But he understands how all that stuff works. In the Traveler universe, you don't have any FTL sensors. There might be an asterisk there. I want to say that there was some alien tech that gave you some idea of what was going on at a longer distance, but for all practical purposes, no FTL sensors. The sublight speeds are relatively low, although they probably shouldn't be considering the acceleration they have. Yeah. And the size, one of the other assumptions is that size should be measured in the most inconvenient unit you can possibly come up with, which in this case is the displacement ton, which is the volume of 1 ton of hydrogen. It is not the mass of 1 ton of hydrogen. It is the volume of 1 ton of hydrogen, which is 14 cubic meters. So when you see that something has a ton of has a size of 400 displacement tons, that does not mean it weighs 400 tons. It means it is whatever 400 times 14 is in size. So yeah, I don't know why they did that. Actually, I think I do know why they did it. It makes it easier to do deck plans, because they can basically say every square is 2 displacement tons worth of size, because, you know, that would be about 6 feet tall. And so, and if you do 1 meter squares, you can now just sort of measure it out that way. So they have this concept of battle riders, which go in and out of favor. In sort of the canonical battle rider is something that has the firepower of a battleship, but it doesn't carry a jump drive. And as a result of that, it can outperform things that battleships that do have to carry a jump drive, because it's not carrying all this extra mass around. So it's usually described in terms of battleship firepower on a smaller hull, but sometimes, especially in the new era, you end up with things that are substantially smaller than that, and they just sort of use the term battle rider to describe the concept of carrying stuff around on a tender, and then you deploy the thing to go fight, which in its own way is really sort of the closest thing we've yet seen in this conversation to what FOUDRE is. I think you could make that argument. So the picture I've got here is not a battle rider, though, because there aren't very much artwork, and it's not very good, that actually shows what a battle rider in the Traveler universe looks like. This is a Dragon class system defense boat, which is basically could be used like a battle rider. And I think there are talks where they say they were used like battle riders in certain situations, but these are really closer to being flotilla. This is actually in its own way closer to just being a regular PT boat, in that you put it in some place that capital ships might come to, and you want to jack them up. And so you put something like this in a place where it can ambush something else, like you hide it in a gas giant or something like that. Gas giants are strategic targets in the Traveler universe. And so you hide it in the gas because people refuel at gas giants. And so you hide it there to script them while they're refueling. So I forget, are either of you two Traveler players? I know that you were both D&D players, but are you Traveler players?
I played Traveler back in the day, but mostly straight role playing. I have not played around with the starships that much. I've got a copy of Ajanti High Lightning down in the cellar somewhere. I should kind of pull that out one day.
Yeah, I love Ajanti High Lightning.
Yeah.
Were you trying to summon me, Chris?
No, why? What did I say to summon you?
RPG?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, yeah. So Larry does not know this, but LYSSA is a professional DM. So she runs games on a game server and has a bunch of different games that she's running at any given time. So
great. Yeah, I've done Traveler, I've done Empire of the Petal Throne, Cthulhu.
There aren't very many Empire of the Petal Throne players out there.
Well, it was fun because Professor Barker was right over there, and we could go over and consult with him if we were stuck on a particular point of how much armor can you put on a Shen kind of thing.
But for the Traveler though, Chris, we integrated because I ran a number of Traveler campaigns, and I integrated them to the 5th Frontier war game and used that as our
like the campaign generator.
Basically, yes.
Yeah. So the latest Martin Doherty book that's come out is his book on the 5th Frontier War.
I'll have to get that one.
It just came out, and it's got a lot of naval background stuff. And so the biggest problem I have with his stuff is that like he at one point he calculates how many admirals there are in the fleet, and he does it by adding up all the combat commands, and he doesn't talk at all about like admirals that would be part of the shore establishment. And he doesn't talk, as near as I can tell, there is no acquisition system in the Third Imperium. Ships just appear, stuff just appears, right? So in the US Navy, if you take a look at the number of at-sea combat command admirals, I mean, even if you include all the COCOMs, include Pac Fleet Actual and all those guys, you add all that stuff up, you probably get to like what? A quarter of the admirals in the Navy?
Maybe a third.
Maybe. Rounding up.
Yeah.
Because a lot of those guys are running programs. They're in OpNav, doing all the essential planning functions. They're making the trains run on time in other places. That doesn't put them on a deck of a ship. They used to do all that stuff, but they're not doing it anymore. Well, some of them used to do it. Some of them are engineering duty officers, and they may have always been shipyard guys, right? But you want high-powered guys running your shipyard. So I think they kind of missed it now in that regard. Now, I couldn't resist the temptation to include my all-time favorite traveler ship, which is the Fiery class close escort. The deck plans were done by Rob Caswell. The illustration in the upper right-hand corner is done by Tom Peters. There's been at least 2 other artists, Jesse DeGraff and Ian Stead, who have also done versions of it. I like the Tom Peters version the best, and the Jesse DeGraff version the second best. But it's a fantastic ship. Now, it is not a carried craft. It's not intended as a carried craft. It's intended as sort of one of those patrol vessels. And Martin Doherty and some of his stuff talks about how, like, if you actually send something like this into a battle, it's going to get its lunch eaten. Fighters get their lunch eaten. The fighters aren't really for going and fighting fleet actions, or they're intended to stay in the peripheral. I shouldn't say they're not intended for fleet actions. It's the idea that you send the appropriate thing after the appropriate target. And so you have basically your flotilla type vessels fighting his flotilla type vessels. So it's more like the pickets fighting the pickets, and stay away from the capital ships because you're all going to get eaten for lunch, which is what happens when you have radar directed guns, right? It's bad. It's bad in a situation like that.
Yeah, these seem to be more meant as like scouts that are built more for speed to get the hell out of Dodge after they assess the situation ahead.
Now that having been said, this in my mind makes a really cool torpedo boat battle rider type thing. I could easily see this showing up in a bunch of the things that we've talked about, especially this is a way cooler version of Geyer's corvettes from the Ganellan series. Because if you go back and you look at those ships in the Ganellan series, right, I love those books. God, those ships are ugly. Oh my God.
He must be French.
Ugly. But if you look at this is a vessel that's approximately the same size of them in terms of the number of crew that you would put on board. And it's got the gig, which, you know, sort of could be the lander thing that he's got. So it's really kind of the same idea. You know, I can easily look at that and go, okay, this works the same way. This works exactly the same way. I would much rather Geyer's vessels look like this than how they look at. And, you know, so when I read it, this is kind of what's in my head. I substitute this over what Scott describes. I love Scott's stuff. Don't get me wrong. I really, really do love his stuff. He was a naval aviator he was an academy grad who found himself on an aircraft carrier as his first tour as a non-rated squadron guy, and was slated to go off to pilot school. But they kind of came to him and said, look, they came to all of them and said, look, you know, there's this post-Vietnam drawdown thing that's going to start happening. And we frankly don't need all of you. And so if you leave now, we'll just like erase your academy requirement, right? You've met your commitment, right? We told you needed to do 6 years. You've done 2 years. We'll just call it even and you can leave. Otherwise, you get to fight it out with everybody else for the few remaining jobs that are left. And so he said, I'm going to pull the handles and leave the aircraft. But I correctly identified him as a naval aviator just based upon stuff I read in the first couple of novels, because he seemed to have a naval aviation approach to things. So I was going to talk about The Expanse, and I totally and completely forgot about talking about The Expanse. But the Rocinante started off as I believe they call it a corvette. Maybe they call it a frigate. I can't remember. That started off as a carried craft on a Martian ship, sort of doing that mission of spreading out the offense and the defense. You never really got to see how the Martians were going to use that craft. And I admit, I haven't read the novels yet. I really need to. So you only sort of see it as a standalone thing. But I can kind of see how you might use it in a battle. It might be something that you detail to go and do boarding actions. It might be something that you use it to sort of spread out the offense or spread out the defense or do picket duties or whatever. I think the Rocinante sort of fits in that category, but I don't fully appreciate how it would fit in that category. And if I had remembered, I would have put some really cool artwork up. That was I just totally spaced it. Okay, on to Star Trek. I'm not really going to go into this now, other than just to point out that you know, anybody who wants to send me something that says this is the torpedo boat equivalent in Star Trek, my first response is which Star Trek, right? I haven't had this little talk in a while, so it's time for this little talk. Which Star Trek are we talking about? Are we talking the TV shows? If so, which ones? The movies? If so, which ones? Tech manuals, you know, stuff like that, canon produced stuff, alpha canon, beta canon, fan produced. Things change over time periods. Was it later? I'm
just going to point out that Modiphius does have a Star Trek TTRPG that is officially licensed now.
Well, yeah, and they're like the 4th officially licensed thing, right?
Yeah.
The FOSSA thing was officially licensed. The Decipher thing was officially licensed. The Last Unicorn thing was officially licensed, and this one is, and they don't agree with each other, and they don't agree with the TV shows. And you know, and the thing is, if you just sort of say, oh, I'm only going to do alpha canon, I'm only going to do stuff that shows up on screen, was it retconned? Because you know, they freely would put stuff up on one episode that they would totally negate in another episode. Trying to tell a consistent story is really hard. So the bad news is trying to tell a consistent story is really hard. The good news is if they present you with a whole bunch of options and they don't agree with each other, I don't have a problem with just sort of picking the ones that I can use to tell the most consistent story. So if you don't give me consistent data, I don't feel like I have to contort myself to try to explain why black and white are simultaneously both the right answer.
Something alternate universes.
Even then, which alternate? Alternate universes don't agree with each other. And I mean,
disbelief.
The biggest difference you have is between the original series and the original series and maybe the animated series, and then everything else that they came up with. But even if you sort of like say, okay, I'm only going to look at Deep Space Nine, I don't think they're consistent. So.
Yeah, no, there are several points in Deep Space Nine that like it does leave you just scratching your head. Don't get me wrong, it's great storytelling.
Yeah.
Like in the moment, it's great storytelling. It's a great episode. But then you look back at the greater picture and it's like, huh. Yeah, you can tell like they were still trying to transition from the more episodic nature of TNG to a more full linear storyline that they started developing in DS9 and then like started doing more of in Voyager.
Yeah. Now, you don't have problems like this in most written stuff. You certainly don't have these problems in the Jerry Mitchell series. So yet another. So let me make another pitch for buying the Jerry Mitchell series. So, Chris, Larry, any thoughts on this?
Chris and I were talking about this before the show started, and the thing is, so much of what we're talking about, just having more than one canon. I mean, the idea of canon itself really didn't exist before Star Trek. The idea, I mean, and I'm dating myself here, but I think a lot of us are at that age. I mean, there was no guarantee that the Star Trek episodes were going to be run in the same order. The idea
and that even happens in modern day, because if you look back at like Firefly, for example,
Firefly's a great
that's
example.
one of the ones that suffered greatly from that, because like it was supposed to be in a certain order and they didn't run it in the correct order, and like people were like, wait.
They delivered,
give me a second.
Delivered the cows before they picked them up.
The modern day term that is like kind of colloquially used is jumping the shark.
Well, no. Jumping the shark is something else.
It's important to remember that the only purpose of the FTL drive in Star Trek was to move the story from one planet where they solved it in the previous episode to a new planet in a new setting where a new story would take place. So it was purely episodic. And
it was the Deus Ex Machina that they created for that purpose. Yeah.
And
the transporter.
And same thing with the transporter. There was no effort at character growth in the main characters. There was no character development that happened with Captain Kirk between the first one they ran and the last one they ran. Spock, all the other characters were made fascinating right out of the bat, but they never matured. They never changed, because that was episodic TV back then. You get to DS9, you get character arcs. I still remember, what was it? Way of the Warrior was one of the first Star Trek episodes where it actually stand by for part 2 next week. Was that Way of the Warrior? Was there another one before then?
In the original Star Trek?
And this was in TNG.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think the first one was in TNG. I think it was during the Borg arc. So I think
a two-parter in TOS.
Was there?
Yeah, remember they took the first pilot and turned it into a.
The pilot was a two-parter.
Oh, okay, but that's different. The pilots are always treated differently, though.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they recut the pilot and used it and put a framing story around it with Captain Pike in the chair and the whole bit. So
I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm not sure I would count that as the first two-parter, because just because of the way that pilots are made.
Could be.
I see a lot of TV shows have two-part pilots simply because they've got so much to set up, so many characters introduced, just to get the rationale of the series going.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of the time they'll do a special, like, extra long thing. And so it's technically 2 parts, but it's shown at once when it's first shown.
If you want to get into the archaeology of it, who was the first person who defined the canon for Star Trek, or even used the term canon to talk about the Star Trek universe? Because I can remember reading some of the early Star Trek books, Making of Star Trek, some of the other stuff, and they were getting into the fact that the fans were really into the tech behind it and the science behind it, but they never really said, okay, let's organize this universe that Star Trek has created and go into a deeper dive. Who did that?
Yep. For some reason, I want to say Bob Justman, but I could be totally wrong about that. Do you have an answer?
No, I do not. I'm raising the question because I just realized it myself. I mean, we use terms like canon and stuff these days as part of the culture, but they really came out of fandom.
Yeah.
And I wonder at what point whether the producers and the writers realized that there was a fan base that really cared about canon. And if they messed up with canon, the fan base would turn on them.
Well, and here's another thing that we have to take into account with all of this, and that's like the technology and the access at the time. Because, like, obviously, like, technology changes are going to cause changes in culture, but, like, when you have a jump from a purely written medium to a listened medium to a visual medium, there's an entire, like, cultural shift that occurs all in one go. And so, like, now, like, obviously, like, with radio shows, you did have the tune in next time bit, but, like, now you get to see it in Technicolor, and you don't have to, like, come up with it in your own head, because there are, like, certain types of, like, neurodivergences and things like that that can cause people to not be able to, like, visualize that in their head. Like, yeah, you can have all of these cool, like, voices and everything, but, like, that's not going to get you anywhere if your brain cannot visualize that. And so for the first time, you have something that people can all sit down at the same time and watch it. And it's not deviating in their head. It's all in front of them at the same time, and you're all seeing it together.
Huh. I hadn't thought about it in those terms. I just thought about it in terms of I want my engineering to be consistent.
Well, like, so, like, I'm viewing it from, like, a sociological perspective on this one.
Well, there's engineering. I mean, every story sets up a universe where certain conditions apply, and normally they're set in our universe. I can remember reading a book. I won't give you the name of it because I'm not recommending this book. It was a submarine book that was sent to me, and it had to do with a submarine trapped under the ice because it had some sort of special metal being used to power it that reacted badly with salt water. So they thought the best place to put this particular metal power plant was aboard a submarine. And the metal, when it is exposed to salt water, becomes red hot, and the entire hull of the submarine became so red hot from the exposure that it melted itself into the polar ice. And then that rescue mission had to be launched to recover. And of course, the Russians launched one as well because they wanted this hotshot technology. And
this seems like a severe design flaw.
Well, breaking 5 fundamental laws of physics in the first 2 chapters really kind of broke me for a little while, and I had to set it aside and then come back. I started taking notes, and they sent this to me for a quote, and I not only did I not give them a quote, I gave them a long explanation why this book should be turned into firelighters and buried in a peat moss and whatever else they did. But if you can make carrying that consistency, that internal consistency from one book to the next, that's what you do in a series. You have to have internal consistency there. If your TV never had that before Star Trek. And that one of the groundbreaking things. And you see that in other shows. How many others? I mean, we binge watch shows now that over the course of an entire series have multiple arcs and build up to some big finish in the finale. That was unheard of in the 60s.
Yeah.
This is really wasn't.
Well, and there's a difference in the time delay that would take too, because when you're having to wait a week or more for an episode to come out, just because they're shooting it that within that next week, that's going to cause one kind of a necessity to do it episodically, but two, you're the want for it is there, but now we have instant gratification. We can watch it all in one go, and so you can watch all of those arcs happen if you're binging in a day or two.
Babylon
over
5 is
several seasons.
Yeah, Babylon 5 is a much different experience if you watch them back to back to back to back.
Which I have done, and I love it.
Yeah, there's all these things where you see, Straczynski you see Straczynski putting guns on mantelpieces.
Yeah.
That don't get fired until later.
Yeah.
Well, and so here's another thing. So from my perspective, because Babylon 5 came out when I was very young, because it came out in 95, right? I believe. Someone correct me if I'm wrong.
That's about right.
Let's see. Babylon 5. 94. So I was I wasn't even 2 when this came out. I'm going to make everyone feel old. Hi, this is the baby here. But so my experience of it, don't get me wrong, I did watch it with my parents when I was that young. But obviously, you're in your formative years and you're barely conscious.
Yeah.
And so my experience with it has primarily been through watching it on the DVDs.
Well, there is a problem with long arcs and character development and everything else and I did not catch the first few episodes of Babylon 5 when it first appeared. I whatever. And I dialed in to watch it at some point, and they said, Londo's going back to Centurion. Everybody goes, and I didn't have a clue what they were talking about.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. That's the advantage of a pure episodic series, is that the viewer can tune in and enjoy the show and not have to worry about what the backstory is. And
yeah,
these days, if you don't pick up episode 1, you're lost. But these days, because it's digital, because it's stored, because it's streaming, we can all start with episode 1. It's the same. We've had this with books forever. You don't want to pick up book 3 of the series until you've read book 1. At least I don't. There's probably
it depends on the series, technically, because some of them are out. It doesn't matter where you pick them up timeline wise, because they're all going concurrently.
Well, murder mysteries tend to be, there's your favorite detective. It doesn't really matter what book you start with.
I think that there's some, you can have character arcs where characters are making progress and are changing over time, that aren't that don't necessarily imply non-episodic television. And I'm thinking of Gul Dukat in that regard, even though it was from an example of non-episodic television, right? Because they clearly had arcs in Deep Space Nine. I remember reading something in Star Trek the magazine with the head writer for Deep Space Nine, who said that the key to writing a villain is you introduce in a television series, right, when you've got the time to do this, is you introduce the villain and you show how villainous they are. And then you show that they're, like, hey, wait a minute, this guy's just like me. He's got a daughter and he loves the daughter and this and that and the other stuff like that.
That's my favorite thing to do in D&D with players. Yeah. It's called giving them emotional damage.
You humanize the villain, and then you put him in a situation at the end where you see that what makes him a villain is what he's willing to do to get what he wants. Right. Well, and you see that with Gul Dukat. Gul Dukat had been totally rehabilitated over time, and he was actually kind of one of them. But then he had the opportunity to grasp the power again, and you saw exactly what he was willing to do to get back to where he was. Yeah. And that's what made him a villain. It was what he was willing to do.
Well, there's this wonderful thing that's been going around on TikTok. It's like the hero would sacrifice you to save the world. The villain would sacrifice the world to save you. Like if it's a romance novel.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot to say about that. I mean, I think there's a lot of truth to that. So I've got one more slide, if I remember correctly, that I should go through, and then we should go ahead and wrap it up because we're already at the 90-minute mark. So theoretically, this is an hour-long show. I think we've had one episode be an hour long. So this is another thing that I want to do a deep dive on, and I've mentioned this before, and that's the Carter Rock proposal for something called the Carriers of Large Objects, which include both aircraft and small surface craft. So the idea was modular ship construction, limited number of hulls, and the idea was that you would have, you configure it one way and you get an aircraft carrier, and you configure it another way and you get an amphib. It's a little bit more complicated than that because yeah, it's more complicated than that. But this was something that NAVSEA put together. And I know the guy who, Lieutenant Commander Bosworth, was one of the guys who did that. Mike has now retired as a civilian NAVSEA employer. He's retired from NAVSEA Carter Rock, and he went off and got a PhD in history. And I see him infrequently at close action games. Mark Campbell will run a game, and I'll see Mike there occasionally. I asked him about these at one point, and he said there was never really any belief that the Navy would sort of adopt their proposal, but they thought it was a conversation worth having, so that it was their way of stimulating the conversation by making some proposals for how they could do things to make shipbuilding easier and less expensive by taking this sort of modular approach. But part of it included these small surface craft. They had a couple of designs that they had in mind that would basically think about what if your amphib deployed something that looked like a surface, like a torpedo boat. What if your amphib deployed torpedo boats instead of deploying LCACs heading to the beach? And I want to do a deeper dive on this because I think it's got a lot to offer for thinking in terms of science fiction. And I also think that, this idea of taking a torpedo boat and using a crane to lower it in the water and more importantly, trying to recover it that way is somewhat problematic. Opening a big hole in the stern of the ship and driving the torpedo boat in and out strikes me as being something that's probably more doable. So I want to pull the thread on that at some point, but I got to reread all those articles because I haven't read them in about a year and a half or 2 years. So that's on the list of things to do. Maybe I'll do that in my voluminous free time when I'm in DC, but probably not. I think I'm going to be spending all my time back in the back at the Navy Lodge just crashing. And that's my last slide. So we should go ahead and call it. But before I do that, Chris, Larry, any parting thoughts?
It was a very interesting discussion, not necessarily about small craft, but I made some notes. There's some things I want to explore. I don't know anything about the Carderock proposal. I'll have to look into that myself.
Yeah, it was all 1990s stuff, and I photocopied some of it when I was up at Newport, and I need to just go online and look for better copies of some of it, because some of them are not the greatest copies in the world. But at Starfleet Tactical, we have a tendency to sort of wander all over the place. The show started when I got invited to be on Axanar After Dark that Alec Peters hosts. And so on a show called Axanar After Dark about Star Trek Axanar and Star Trek and everything else like that, we spent 90 minutes talking about Warhammer 40K. And so that sort of set the tone for the rest of the show. And so we frequently go off on tangents and the tangent might, there are times where I'll do 80 minutes on naval history with just sort of like, oh, by the way, there's also this thing called science fiction. So, and on the list of people to have on the show, like I want to have Trent Hone to come on the show and talk about the importance of doctrine and stuff like that. So Trent's already said he's willing to do that. So at some point I'll have Trent on the show, and I've talked about him a couple of times. And I think I want to have John Parshall to come on the show as well. So
that'd be great.
So, and Tom Mays has already said that he's interested. Tom's got to be close to retirement. He's the commander of the newest one of those weird. I can never remember the class of the ship. It's the follow-on to the Chesty Puller. They're sort of like. I'm sorry, what?
ESBs. Yeah,
I don't know. I can't remember if ESB is the current term or not, but he's the CO of the John Canley. Or he's like the blue or gold CO of the John Canley. And they've got a very interesting structure in that he is the commander of that ship, but he is not the master. They have a civilian master and a civilian crew and a military crew. And that
gets complicated.
Yeah, he's the mission commander, but he's not the master of the ship.
I guarantee there'll be a conflict at some point.
Well, and it's interesting, and I want to, and unfortunately, they finally commissioned her, so I don't know if he's ever going to get it. He's been there a while. I don't know if he's ever going to get the chance to take her to sea.
Well, I hope he does.
Yeah, but John wrote this fantastic book called A Sword into Darkness, based upon the premise that an internet billionaire is totally and completely convinced that the weird astronomical effect is the drive flare from a decelerating alien starship. And he can't get anybody in DOD or NASA to take him seriously. And so he says, well, I'm an internet billionaire. Maybe I'll just solve this problem. And so he develops the technology. He funds a bunch of research and develops the technology up to and including full up ship designs and builds the ships. And finally, by the time NASA and DOD go, on second thought, I guess it is a starship. I wish we would have started 30 years ago. He says, yeah, you guys didn't, but I did. So it's a really cool novel, and he's planning to write sequels, and he just hasn't gotten around to it yet because he keeps staying in the Navy. I think he thought his career was going to be over much longer ago. His comment was, "They keep giving me command. How'd that happen?"
Well, mistakes can be made, and sometimes they work out for the better.
Yeah, so he's on like his third command. But they've all been sort of weird ones. Like he commanded an amphibious boat unit detachment, and he commanded. He had something in the sandbox that he was the CO for, and then he got the Canley. So, but good guy. He used to live in Norfolk. I met him in the Norfolk science fiction community, and then now he's out in San Diego. So, but All right, so I think we're ready to call it a night. Any parting shots from either of you?
No, sir. I think we're good to go.
All right, thank you very much. Don't run away right away. We'll talk after we finish the show.
Okay.
Thank you very much for being part of Starfleet Tactical. I'm sure there's a whole bunch of stuff that Chris and I have talked about him coming back on. Like I've said, I want to talk about naval treaties and how the treaties of the 20s and 30s set the context for the entire tactical and strategic discussion that took place after it. The strategic discussion is really pretty obvious, but the tactical discussion, I can summarize that as you don't plan on fighting battles with aircraft carriers when you're only limited to 3 or 4 aircraft carriers. And so you plan on fighting the battle with the assets that you actually have. And so then when the treaties go away, you spend a lot of time going like, okay, now we can build stuff. What are we going to build? And so that makes it that's the essential context in understanding all of that. But that is a show for another time. In the meantime, thank you very much, everybody. And we will see you not next week. We will see you the next 4 weeks. I am off, and then I'll see you in the 5th week. Thank you very much, everybody.
Be well.